Summer in the small town of Willow Grove smelled of mown grass and hot asphalt. John Miller, sitting in an old pickup, looked at the familiar streets that seemed unchanged in the years he had been away. Houses with white picket fences, neatly trimmed lawns, the sign of the old Star movie theater with faded letters, all this caused a mixture of nostalgia and anxiety in him. He adjusted the rearview mirror, looked at his reflection, a face roughened by the sun and wind of distant deserts, eyes frozen with fatigue, and a slight gray at the temples. John was home, but he felt like an outsider. He parked outside his mother's house, a two-story building with a porch where, as children, he and his brothers had played cards until midnight. Linda Miller, his mother, was already standing at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face, lined but still full of life, broke into a smile when she saw her son. "Johnny," she cried, rushing towards him as soon as he got out of the car. "Oh my God, you're back after all." John hugged her, feeling her thin shoulders shake with emotion. She smelled of flower and lavender, as she always did when she cooked something special. "Mom, I promised," he said, trying to smile. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken for months. He promised," Linda grumbled, pulling back to examine him. "Thin as a stick. What did they do to you there? Didn't feed you at all?" "We did, Mom. Just. Not your kind of pies," he winked, and Linda laughed, though there was a flicker of worry in her eyes. Inside the house, the family was already gathering. The dining room was decorated simply but with soul. A tablecloth with embroidered flowers, porcelain plates that Linda took out only on special occasions. Emily, John's wife, stood by the window, holding a glass of wine. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and her dress emphasized her slender figure. She turned to John, and her smile seemed a little forced to him. "John," she said, coming closer, "you're back." He nodded, accepting her embrace. It was warm, but there was a certain stiffness to it, as if she was hugging him out of politeness. John pushed the thought away. After so many months apart, he didn't want to look for a catch. "You look good, Em," he said, and it was true. She had always been beautiful, but now there was a new confidence about her, almost a cockiness. "Thank you," she replied, looking away. "I tried." His brothers were already seated at the table. David, the middle one, with dark eyes like John's but softer features, looked up from the book he was leafing through. He was always quiet, preferring to watch rather than speak. But in his gaze, John saw a spark he had not seen before, something alive, almost feverish. "Hello, hero," David said, smiling at the corner of his mouth. "How are things in the sands?" "It's hot," John answered briefly, sitting down next to her. "Are you still reading?" "Someone has to be smart in this family," David joked, but his tone was warm. Matt, the younger one, burst into the room with an energy that reminded John of the puppy they'd once adopted. He was only 20 and still looked like a teenager. Tousled hair, a t-shirt with some kind of comic book print, a wide smile. "John, dude, you're really back." Matt slapped him on the shoulder, almost knocking over his chair. "Tell me something cool, like shooters, chases." "Matt," Linda snapped, setting a bowl of mashed potatoes on the table. "Let your brother eat in peace." "Come on, Mom, I'm just asking." Matt plopped down in his chair, still beaming. The doorbell interrupted their conversation. Linda hurried to open it, and Thomas and Catherine Hughes walked into the house. Thomas, a neighbor and local policeman, was a large man with a loud voice and a habit of speaking as if he were giving orders. His wife, Catherine, on the other hand, was soft and warm, with a smile that could put anyone at ease. She went straight to Emily, embracing her as if she were an old friend. "Emily, you've stolen the show again," Catherine said, looking at her dress. "Where do you get that?" "Oh, just luck," Emily replied, her laugh sounding a little louder than it should have. Thomas shook John's hand a little longer than necessary, as if testing his strength. "I'm glad you're back, Miller," he said. "Willow Grove just wasn't the same without you." "Thank you, Tom," John replied, feeling the tension in the room become almost palpable. The last to appear was Susan Carter, a family friend and local psychologist. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her wire-rimmed glasses gave her the look of someone who always knew more than she was saying. She put her arm around John, her gaze attentive, almost searching. "John, are you okay?" she asked quietly while the others were distracted by conversation. "I'm fine, Suze," he replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "If anything happens, you know where to find me," she added before moving back to the table. Lunch began with the usual buzz of conversation. Linda was telling the story of how Matt had almost failed his biology exam, but had passed it thanks to a tutor. Matt was indignant that it had been a complete fluke. David was silent, but his eyes were watching everyone, as if he were putting together a puzzle. Emily was laughing at Catherine's jokes, but her fingers were fiddling nervously with the edge of the tablecloth. John noticed, but decided not to pay attention. He was tired, or maybe he was just paranoid. "John, tell me what it was like," Thomas asked, cutting off a piece of meat. "No details, of course, but something." John shrugged, looking at his plate. "Dust, heat, orders," he said. "Nothing interesting." "Nothing interesting?" Matt interjected. "Come on, you were, like, in the thick of it." "Matt," Emily said sharply, her voice suddenly sharp. Everyone was silent for a moment. "What?" Matt raised his eyebrows. "I'm just curious." "Maybe John doesn't want to talk about it," Catherine said softly, placing her hand on Emily's shoulder. "Give him time." Emily nodded, but her cheeks flushed slightly. John looked at her, trying to figure out what was behind her reaction. She quickly looked away. "It's okay," he said, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm just glad to be home." Linda smiled, but her eyes were full of worry. "We're all happy, Johnny. You can't imagine how much we've been waiting." After dinner, everyone moved to the veranda. The evening was warm, and the stars were just beginning to appear in the dark sky. John sat in an old rocking chair that had once belonged to his father, Oliver. He remembered how his father, sitting in that same chair, would tell him and his brothers stories about his travels around the country. Oliver was a strict man, but fair, and his words always carried weight. "Honesty is the only thing that makes us human," he said. John closed his eyes, trying to push the memories away. Emily came out onto the veranda with a glass of wine in her hand. She sat down next to him, but not too close. "You've changed," she said quietly, looking into the distance. "War changes," he answered without looking at her. "Not just war," she added, and there was a note in her voice he couldn't decipher. "What do you mean?" he asked, turning to face her. She hesitated, as if regretting her words. "Nothing. It's just, you became quieter, more closed." "And you?" he asked, his voice sounding sharper than he intended. Emily looked at him, her eyes narrowed. "I was just living, John, while you were gone." The tension between them hung in the air like smoke. John wanted to say something, but he was interrupted by David's voice, who came out onto the veranda with a bottle of beer. "Hey, you two, don't fight on the first night," he said, smiling, but his gaze was attentive. "John, tell me how you survived without your mother's pies." John laughed, although it was hard to do. Believe me, it was harder than dodging bullets. The conversation continued, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Emily avoided his gaze, David was too attentive, and Matt, despite his talkativeness, seemed wary. Even Linda, usually so warm and open, looked like she was hiding something. John took a sip of his beer, feeling the cold liquid burn his throat. He was home, but home didn't seem the same as he remembered. Later, when the guests had left and Linda had gone to bed, John was alone on the porch. He looked at the stars, trying to find answers in them. Memories of his father came back to him. Oliver had once told him, "Family is everything, John, but even in the family, the truth can be a heavy burden." John had not understood what he meant. Now, sitting in the dark, he was beginning to suspect that the truth his father had spoken of might be closer than he had thought. Morning at the Miller house began with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft clink of dishes coming from the kitchen. The sun lazily filtered through the curtains, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. Matt, the youngest of the brothers, came downstairs, rubbing his eyes. His hair was sticking up in all directions, and his t-shirt with the logo of some rock band was slightly wrinkled from sleep. He was not fully awake yet, but the smell of bacon was drawing him like a magnet. The kitchen was the heart of the home, the place where Linda Miller reigned supreme. She stood at the stove, deftly flipping strips of bacon in the pan, humming an old tune under her breath. Her movements were practiced, like someone who had spent decades preparing meals for her family. Matt plopped down on a chair at the table, grabbing an apple from the bowl. "Good morning, Mom," he muttered, taking a bite. "Where is everyone?" "Good morning, my boy," Linda answered without turning around. "John is still asleep, poor thing. Tired from the journey, I suppose. David is somewhere in the living room, reading, as usual. And Emily." She hesitated. "I think she went to the pantry for some milk." Matt nodded, not really paying attention. His mind was on the upcoming lecture at the university. He had been putting off studying for the literature exam for a week now, and it was starting to bother him. But now, sitting in the warm kitchen, he decided that a few minutes of laziness wouldn't hurt anyone. "Mom, when John wakes up, will he tell you anything about the army?" Matt asked, chewing an apple. He seemed kind of different yesterday. Linda turned, her face serious for a moment. "Give him time, Matt. War isn't something you talk about over breakfast. Your father." She trailed off, as if remembering something painful. He didn't like to talk about difficult things either. Matt shrugged. He barely remembered his father Oliver had died when Matt was only 10. But the image of his father, strict but fair, remained in his memory, like a photograph you look at often, but the details begin to blur. "Okay, I'll go get some juice," he said, standing up. "The fridge is empty." "There's some in the pantry," Linda said, returning to the frying pan. "Just don't wake John if you make noise in there." Matt headed for the pantry, which was at the end of the hall, next to the back door. It was a small room, filled with shelves of canned goods, cereals, and odds and ends. The door was slightly open, and he was about to enter when he heard muffled voices. Matt froze, instinctively pressing himself against the wall. The voices were quiet, almost a whisper, but he recognized them immediately: David and Emily. "Not now," Emily said, her tone tense, almost pleading. "You know he just got back." "I know," David replied, his voice, usually calm and composed, shaking with emotion. "But do you think I can just pretend it's not there?" Matt frowned, trying to figure out what they were talking about. He peered cautiously through the crack between the door and the frame. Emily was standing by the shelf, holding a can of coffee, but her fingers were nervously clenching the tin lid. David was closer than he should have been, his hand almost touching her shoulder. Their eyes met, and there was something about it that made Matt's throat go dry. This didn't feel like a normal conversation. This was too personal. "David, please." Emily took a step back, but her movement was uncertain, as if she didn't know what she wanted. "Not here, not now." "Then when?" he asked, and Matt heard a mixture of pain and anger in his voice. "You think I don't see the way you look at him? Like he's a hero and I'm—" "Stop it," she snapped. "You know that's not true." Matt felt his heart beat faster. He wasn't sure he had heard correctly, but the scene before him seemed wrong, like a still from a movie he wasn't supposed to see. He stepped back, trying not to make a sound, and went back into the kitchen, the juice forgotten. His thoughts were racing. Had he made a mistake? Was this just a fight, something small? But something in their voices, in their postures, said it was more than that. "Did you find the juice?" Linda asked, not looking up from the stove. No," Matt muttered, sitting back down. "Changed my mind." Linda looked at him, narrowing her eyes. "Why are you so pale? What happened?" "Nothing," he answered quickly, forcing himself to smile. "Just didn't get enough sleep." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on him a little too long. Matt turned away, looking out the window. He didn't know what to do with what he'd seen. Tell John? No, that would be too much. What if he was wrong? He decided to keep quiet for now, but the thought of what he'd seen burned inside him. A few minutes later, Emily walked into the kitchen. She looked as usual calm, collected, with a slight smile. She was holding a can of coffee in her hands. "Found it," she said, putting the jar on the table. "Matt, why are you so thoughtful?" "Oh, nothing," he shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Just thinking about exams." "Oh, these exams of yours," Emily laughed, but her laughter seemed unnatural to Matt. "Don't worry, you always get out of it." David followed, his face expressionless, as if nothing had happened. He nodded at Matt and sat down at the table, opening his book. Matt looked at him, trying to find some clue as to what he had seen in the closet, but David was as calm as ever. "What are you reading?" Matt asked, just to fill the silence. "Dostoevsky," David replied without looking up. "Crime and Punishment. I wonder how people deal with guilt." Matt felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure if the words were accidental or if David somehow knew he'd overheard. "Cool," he squeezed out, looking away. At that moment, John walked into the kitchen. His hair was damp from the shower and his face still showed signs of fatigue. He smiled when he saw his family at the table. "Good morning," he said, sitting down next to Emily. "It smells like heaven." "It's Mom," Emily said, placing her hand on his shoulder. Her gesture was light, almost casual, but Matt saw David's jaw tighten for a moment. "John, you have to tell us something," Matt said, trying to distract himself from his thoughts. "You know, about the army, something not scary." John chuckled, but his eyes remained serious. "It wasn't all scary, Matt. Sometimes it was just boring. You're sitting there, waiting for orders, and there's nothing but sand and flies around." "Flies?" Matt laughed. "Seriously?" "Seriously," John nodded. "They're about the size of a fist." Emily smiled, but her gaze slid to David, and Matt noticed. He felt something unpleasant stir in his chest again. He wanted to believe that he was wrong, that it was just his imagination. But the image of Emily and David in the pantry wouldn't leave his head. Later, when breakfast was over, Matt volunteered to help Linda with the dishes to distract himself. They stood at the sink, and he silently scrubbed the plates while Linda dried them with a towel. "Matt, are you sure you're okay?" she asked, looking at him with that motherly insight that was impossible to escape. "Yes, Mom, everything is fine," he replied, but his voice sounded unconvincing. "You've always been the most open of my boys," she said, touching his hand. "If something's wrong, you know you can tell me." Matt nodded, but said nothing. He couldn't tell her what he'd seen. Not now. Not until he was sure. Meanwhile, John and Emily walked out into the backyard. John sat down on an old bench, looking out at the garden that Linda loved so much. Emily stood next to him, her arms crossed. "Are you really okay?" she asked, her voice softer than the day before. "And you?" he answered with a question, looking into her eyes. "You're somehow distant." Emily sighed, looking away. "It's just, everything changed, John. You left, and I stayed. Life didn't stand still." "I know," he said, and there was bitterness in his voice. "But I'm back, Em. I'm here." "I know," she replied, but her words sounded empty. Matt, finished with the dishes, walked out onto the porch and saw them. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see Emily looking away and John looking at her with some mixture of hope and pain. And in that moment, Matt realized that he couldn't just ignore what he was seeing. Something was wrong with this house, and he felt, despite his naivety, that the shadow he'd spotted in the pantry might be something much more. The days in Willow Grove dragged on, like syrup from an old bottle that refused to flow, but at the same time they were filled with that quiet, almost imperceptible bustle that is typical of small towns, where everyone knows everyone else, and secrets are hidden behind thin walls of smiles and casual conversations. Susan Carter, with her keen psychologist's eye that could penetrate any mask, sat in her cozy living room, furnished with soft chairs and shelves filled with books on psychoanalysis and self-development, and reflected on a recent dinner at the Millers. She always loved these family gatherings, where under a layer of laughter and jokes you could see real emotions, like an archaeologist digging up ancient artifacts under a layer of sand. But this time, something was wrong, something vibrated in the air, like an invisible string ready to snap at the slightest touch. Susan leaned back in her chair, holding a mug of herbal tea, the steam rising to create ethereal patterns in the morning sun that filtered through the lace curtains. Her thoughts were on Emily, the bright, confident woman who had always seemed to Susan the epitome of modern independence. But now there was a crack in her demeanor, subtle but all the more intriguing for that. The coldness toward John, fresh from a distant land where he had risked his life for something more than the daily grind, was strange, almost unnatural. Emily, who had once looked at her husband with a warmth that could melt ice, now looked away. Her smiles were stingy, like coins tossed to a beggar. Her touches were rare and mechanical, as if she were performing a ritual rather than expressing real affection. And then those glances at David. Susan remembered Emily giving him those soft, almost tender glances during dinner, lasting a little longer than was appropriate between a sister-in-law and brother-in-law. David, that quiet, thoughtful man, always hiding behind his books and silent observations, would suddenly come alive under those glances, his eyes flashing like stars in the night sky, full of hidden passion that seemed about to burst forth. Susan, with her professional instincts, knew that there was something deep here, perhaps forbidden, something that could destroy the fragile balance of the Miller family like a house of cards in a gust of wind. She decided not to sit back. She was a psychologist, after all, and her job was to help people understand their emotions, even if they didn't ask for it. Susan dialed Emily's number, her fingers gliding lightly across the phone screen, and after a few rings, her friend's voice came through, sounding a little distracted, as if she were lost in her own thoughts. "Hi, Suze," Emily said, a slight weariness in her tone that she tried to disguise with cheerfulness. "What do you owe the early call to? Are you missing my gardening stories already?" Susan smiled, though Emily couldn't see it, and her voice became soft, inviting to trust, like a cozy blanket on a cold evening. "Oh, Em, you know I'm always up for hearing about your roses and how they stubbornly refuse to bloom despite your best efforts. But seriously, let's meet up today. Maybe coffee at the Old Oak. I've got a couple of hours to spare, and I thought we could use a heart-to-heart chat like old times." Emily hesitated for a second, and Susan could almost hear her weighing her words, but then she agreed, her voice a little warmer. "Okay, sounds tempting. Will 2 o'clock be okay?" "Perfect," Susan replied, and they said goodbye. But her mind was already spinning with questions she wanted to ask, careful as a surgeon makes an incision so as not to damage important tissue. The Old Oak Cafe was one of those places in Willow Grove where time seemed to slow down. Wooden tables worn from too many elbows, soft light from lamps shaped like leaves, and the aroma of freshly ground coffee mixed with the smell of homemade baked goods that beckoned like a sailor's siren. Susan had arrived a little earlier, ordered a cinnamon latte, and sat by the window, watching the people pass by. A young mother pushing a stroller, an older man walking his dog, who sniffed every bush with the enthusiasm of an explorer. Emily walked with confidence as she entered, but Susan noticed her fiddling nervously with the strap of her bag, as if seeking support in this small gesture. "Hey," Emily said, sitting down across from her and ordering an espresso, her favorite drink for those moments when she needed to collect her thoughts. "So, tell me, what's new with you? How are your patients? Still trying to convince you that their problems can be solved in one session?" Susan laughed, her laugh genuine and lightening the mood, and she pushed a strand of hair out of her face before answering. "Oh, people always hope for a miracle, but real change comes slowly, like the growth of a tree, which first sends its roots deep into the earth before reaching for the sky. And you, how about John? He just got back. There must be so much accumulated." Emily nodded, but her gaze slid to the side, to the street, where the sun played on the leaves of the trees, creating dancing shadows on the asphalt. "John, he's okay, I think. It's just, war leaves its marks. He's become more withdrawn, less vocal about his feelings, more silent, staring into space, as if he sees something there that we don't. Susan leaned closer, her eyes full of empathy, but behind them was an analytical mind, picking apart every word. And you, how do you feel about his return? It's not easy when a person leaves one way and returns another, and you have to relearn how to live together, find a common language in this new rhythm. Emily stirred her coffee with a spoon. The sound of metal on ceramic was soft, but in the silence of the cafe, it seemed loud as a heartbeat. It feels strange, like we've become strangers over the past months. I'm used to my routine, to coping alone, and now he's here, and everything changes. Sometimes I find myself getting angry at him for no reason, just because he disrupts my routine. Susan nodded, but her thoughts had already moved on. She remembered how Emily had looked at David at dinner, with a softness that bordered on tenderness, and how David had responded in kind, his usually calm face coming alive, his eyes shining as if they reflected a secret fire. "What about David?" she asked carefully, as if throwing a trial ball at a bowling alley to see how many pins would fall. "He's always been such a support for the family, quiet but reliable. Do you talk to him much?" Emily froze for a moment, her spoon hovering in midair, and Susan noticed her cheeks turning slightly pink, but she quickly pulled herself together, smiling at the corner of her mouth. "David. Oh yeah, he's great. Always willing to help, listen. While John was gone, he'd often come by, fix things around the house, just chat. He understands me, without words." The words hung in the air, and Susan felt the puzzle begin to fit together. The coldness toward John, the distance, and in contrast, the warmth toward David that might be more than just friendship. Her imagination, trained by years of working with human souls, painted a picture. Perhaps in John's absence, Emily and David had found solace in each other, first in conversation, then in touch, and now this secret was burning inside them, like a hidden fire beneath a layer of ash. Understood without words. Susan repeated thoughtfully, taking a sip of tea that had cooled but was still fragrant. "It's rare when someone can read your thoughts, feel your emotions, without requiring an explanation. But sometimes such connections can complicate things, especially in a family where everything is intertwined, like the roots of an old oak tree." Emily looked at her sharply, her eyes narrowing, but then she laughed, trying to deflect suspicion. "Oh, Suze, you always see more than there is. It's just brotherly concern. David is part of the family, nothing more." But Susan wasn't convinced. She could see Emily's nervous fingers twitching, her eyes darting around, and it all spoke of an inner conflict, a secret she wasn't ready to reveal. They continued the conversation, moving on to lighter topics. The new book Susan was reading, her vacation plans, but the psychologist had a plan in mind. She decided to watch more closely, maybe talk to David, to see what was going on behind that calm facade. After the meeting, Susan walked through the park, where the leaves rustled in the gentle breeze and the birds sang their eternal songs, and her thoughts swirled around the Miller family. She imagined Oliver, her late father, looking down on them with the strict morals he taught his sons. Honesty above all else, family sacred. But life does not always follow the rules, and Susan's imagination painted a scenario in which the secret passion between Emily and David blossomed like a forbidden flower in a garden full of thorns, threatening to tear apart the bonds that held them all together. That evening, Susan decided to drop by the Millers, under the pretext of returning a book Linda had lent her a month earlier. The house greeted her with the warmth of the light from the windows and the aroma of dinner wafting from the kitchen. Linda opened the door, her face lit up with a smile, but there was a weariness in her eyes, as if she were carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders. "Susan, dear, come in," she said, hugging her friend. "We're just sitting down to dinner. Will you join us?" Susan agreed, and soon she was sitting at the table with the family. John at the head, looking tired but determined, Emily next to her, studiously avoiding his gaze, David opposite, lost in his thoughts, Matt chattering incessantly about his university, and Linda fussing with the dishes. During dinner, Susan watched Emily pass the salt to David, their fingers barely touching, but there was electricity in the touch, like a spark in the dark. She smiled at his joke, her eyes warming, while to John she spoke shortly, dryly, like a telegram. John seemed not to notice or pretended to be lost in his memories of the service, but Susan saw the tension in his shoulders, as if he knew instinctively that something was wrong. After dinner, when everyone had left, Susan stayed with Linda in the kitchen, helping wash the dishes. The running water provided a backdrop for a confidential conversation. "Linda, did you notice something strange?" Susan asked quietly, passing the plate. "Between Emily and John and David." Linda froze, her gloved hands clenched around the sponge, and she sighed, looking out the window where the night had already fallen, strewn with stars. "Oh, Suze, you always see everything. I I don't know. Emily changed while John was gone. And David. He was always so sensitive. But I hope it's just me, an old woman who thinks too much." Susan placed her hand on her friend's shoulder, feeling her tremble slightly. "Fantasy or not, if something exists, it can grow like a weed in a garden and choke out everything good. Maybe we should talk." Linda nodded, but her eyes were full of fear of the truth that could destroy her family. Meanwhile, in the living room, David stood by the window, looking at the moon, which hung low on the horizon like a silver disk full of mysteries. He thought about Emily, about how her presence lit a fire in him that he tried to extinguish but could not. His fantasy carried him away to a world where there were no taboos, where they could be together, but reality reminded him of his brother, of duty, of the morality that his father instilled. Susan, as she said goodbye, took one last look at the house full of secrets and thought that soon the shadows would come to light, and then everything would change forever, like in those stories where the truth becomes the catalyst for the storm. But for now the night was quiet, and secrets lurked in the corners, waiting for their moment, and Susan, with her irrepressible curiosity and professional instinct, was ready to unravel them, step by step, like a detective in a gripping novel, where every turn brings new discoveries. She walked down the street, the wind whispering through the leaves, and her imagination painted possible scenarios. Confrontation, tears, reconciliations, or breakups, all of it swirling in her head like a whirlwind of autumn leaves, full of color and chaos. And in the miller's house, Emily lay in bed next to John, listening to his even breathing, but her thoughts were with David, and she felt guilt like a heavy stone on her chest, but also excitement from the forbidden, which made her life brighter, more dangerous. Matt, in his room, tossed and turned, remembering what he had seen in the closet and wondering whether he should speak up or keep quiet until everything became clear. John slept restlessly, dreams of war mixed with the feeling that something was wrong at home, as if an enemy was lurking in the closest quarters. And only Linda, sitting in a chair with knitting in her hands, prayed silently that the family would endure as it had before, under the leadership of Oliver, whose portrait hung on the wall, reminding them of their former strength. But secrets have a way of growing, and Susan knew this better than anyone, her imagination already weaving a web of possible outcomes, each of which was full of drama and human passions. The next day, Susan met David in the park, under the pretext of discussing a book he had recommended. They sat on a bench, surrounded by flowers and birdsong, and the conversation gradually turned to family. "David, you've always been so observant," she said, looking at him with interest. "Tell me, how do you see the situation with John and Emily? They seem distant." David tensed, his fingers tightening on the edge of the bench, but he smiled, trying to look casual. "Distant? Well, war changes people. They need time to get used to each other again." But Susan saw his eyes avoid hers, and she pressed softly, like the gas pedal of a car about to take off. "What about your relationship with Emily? You became closer while John was away. Is that normal?" He looked at her sharply, but then sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Closer. Yes, we talked a lot. She was alone, so I helped. Nothing more." But his voice faltered, and Susan realized that there was a root here, deep and tangled, and her imagination painted a story of love born of loneliness, of passion hidden behind the facade of everyday life. She didn't press further, but a plan was already forming in her head, to help them figure this out before it all collapsed like a house of sand under a wave. As the days went by, Susan's observations accumulated. The stolen glances, the casual touches, the coldness in Emily's words to John, and she knew that soon the time would come for the conversation that would change everything. In her office, full of books and soft light, she took notes, her pen gliding over the paper, capturing details, and her imagination carried her away to possible futures where the family either falls apart or grows stronger after going through the fire. But for now, the secrets remained in the shadows, and Willow Grove lived its life, unaware of the storm brewing in one of its homes. The dim light in the rusty anchor cast long shadows across wooden tables scarred by years of drunken arguments and the occasional slam of a mug. It was a place where Willow Grove let its masks down, where farmers complained about the drought, where office workers gossiped, and where old-timers reminisced about a time when the town was smaller, but they claimed warmer. The air smelled of hops and fried potatoes and something faintly nostalgic, like an old leather jacket pulled out of the closet after a long winter. David Miller sat in the corner, in the shadows, the light from the neon Budweiser sign brushing his face, giving his eyes an uneasy glint. Across from him sat Thomas Hughes, the local cop, his uniform neatly folded at home and a faded denim jacket on his back. His large figure took up almost all the space at the table, and the mug of beer in his hand seemed like a toy. David twirled his bottle of beer, the label beginning to peel under his fingers. He had been silent all evening, answering Thomas's questions in monosyllables until Thomas couldn't take it any more and leaned closer, his voice lower but firmer, as if he were interrogating a suspect. "Well, David, spill it," Thomas said, taking a sip of beer and wiping the foam from his lips. "You're sitting here like you're at a funeral, not a bar. What's gnawing at you? John's back, everyone's happy, and you look like you swallowed a nail." David looked up, his eyes heavy as lead. He ran a hand through his hair, which, despite his usual neatness, was a little disheveled today, as if he had played with it more than once in thought. The bar was buzzing around them. Laughter at the bar, the clink of pool balls, an old rock ballad playing on the jukebox, but to David it was all just background noise, drowned out by the internal noise that was haunting him. "It's not that simple, Tom," he said finally, his voice quiet but with a storm in it, ready to break out. I, I'm in a mess. I don't know how to get out of it." Thomas narrowed his eyes, his brows drawing together like dark clouds that foreshadowed a storm. He had known David since childhood. He had always been the middle ground in the Miller family. Not as tough as John, not as naive as Matt, but with a depth that few noticed behind his silence. And now Thomas felt that depth had turned into a pool that was sucking his friend in. "Confused?" he asked, setting his mug down on the table with a light thud. "Is this about work, money, or something more serious?" David chuckled, but his laugh was as bitter as the cheap beer he was drinking. He looked at Thomas as if deciding whether to open a Pandora's box he had kept closed for so long. But in this bar, under the dim light and the hum of other people's voices, he suddenly felt that he could no longer remain silent. "It's about Emily," he said quietly, almost in a whisper, as if he were afraid the walls would hear. I shouldn't feel this, Tom. I know I shouldn't, but I can't stop." Thomas froze, his hand stopping mid-motion to grab his mug. He looked at David, a mixture of surprise and stern understanding in his eyes, as if he had long suspected something but hoped he was wrong. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, and his voice hardened like the asphalt in the hot sun. "Emily, John's wife?" he asked, although the answer was obvious. "David, are you serious? Do you realize what you've gotten yourself into?" David nodded, his fingers gripping the bottles so tightly it felt like the glass was going to crack. He looked at the table as if the answers to all his questions were written there, but all he saw were beer stains and someone's carved initials. "I know," he said, his voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. "I know it's wrong. But when John was gone, she was different. We talked for hours about everything. She laughed, Tom, and that laughter, it was like medicine. I didn't plan it, it just happened. And now I don't know how to stop it." Thomas sighed, his face hardening like a man who had seen too many mistakes, his own and others. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his voice low and firm, like an order that could not be disobeyed. "Listen to me, David, and listen carefully," he said. "You're walking on thin ice, and it's already cracking beneath you. Emily is your brother's wife, John's, the one who risked his life while you were here fixing her faucets and drinking coffee in her kitchen. You think this is a game? This isn't just your feelings, it's dynamite that could blow up your entire family." David looked up, his eyes full of pain, but there was also a spark of stubbornness in them, as if he still clung to the hope that this could be justified. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice a little louder, but still shaking. "But you don't understand, Tom. She sees me. Not just as brother John, not as quiet David with his books. She sees the real me, and I can't pretend it's not there." Thomas shook his head, his expression growing even darker. He took a sip of beer, as if trying to swallow the irritation that was building up inside him. "The real you?" he asked, the sarcasm cutting like a knife. "What happens when John finds out? Because he will, David. These things don't stay in the shadows. You think he's just going to shake your hand and say, 'Come on, bro, love my wife, it's okay'? He's a military man, for fuck's sake. He's seen things you and I never dreamed of. And if he feels betrayed, it won't end with just talking." David clenched his jaw, his fingers fiddling nervously with the label, tearing it off piece by piece. He knew Thomas was right, but the truth was like acid, eating away at him from the inside. He remembered Emily looking at him in the pantry, her eyes full of confusion and desire, her voice shaking with fear and something else he didn't want to name. It was like a fire he couldn't put out even if he wanted to. "I don't know what to do," he finally admitted, his voice quieter, almost pleading. "I've tried to stay away, but she's like a magnet. Every time I see her, I say to myself, enough, this is the end. But then she smiles, or touches my hand, or just says something, and I'm lost." Thomas looked at him, and there was something between pity and irritation in his eyes. He knew David as a man who always tried to do the right thing, but now he saw not that reasonable guy, but a man teetering on the edge of an abyss. "Listen," Thomas said, his voice softening a little, but still as hard as granite. "I'm not your father to lecture you, but I am your friend, and I'm going to tell you straight, you have to stop. Now, before it's too late. If you keep this up, it won't just ruin your life, it'll ruin your whole family. Linda wouldn't survive her sons tearing each other apart over a woman. And Matt, he looks at you like heroes. What's going to happen when he finds out? And Emily, do you think she's ready to leave John for you? Are you sure she's not just as confused as you are?" David was silent, his gaze falling on the bottle, which was almost empty. Thomas's words were like hammer blows, each one hitting its mark, but instead of clarifying his thoughts, they only added to the chaos in his head. He thought of Emily, how she laughed at his jokes, how her hand lingered on his shoulder a little longer than necessary, how her eyes searched the room for him, even when John was nearby. And he thought of John, his older brother, the man who had always been an example of strength and honor for him. Guilt choked him like a rope around his neck, but passion burned brighter, and he didn't know how to extinguish that fire. "I don't want to lose her," he said finally, almost in a whisper, as if confessing could ruin everything right here and now. Thomas sighed, his face softening, but his eyes remaining stern. "You're losing yourself already, David," he said, "and if you don't stop, you'll lose a lot more. Think of John. Think of your mother. Think of what Oliver would say if he could see you now." The name of his father, Oliver, hit David like a slap in the face. He remembered his face, stern but full of love, his voice that said, "Honesty is what makes us human." Oliver had been David's beacon, and the thought of betraying his principles was unbearable. But the thought of giving up Emily was no less excruciating. "I'll try," he said at last, but his voice was full of doubt, like a cracked bridge about to collapse. Thomas nodded, but there was no confidence in his gaze. He knew that such promises were easy to make in a bar, under the noise of music and the haze of intoxication, but in real life they dissolved like sugar in hot coffee. "Try it," he said, "and stay away from her until you figure yourself out. And if you can't, talk to her. But honestly, David, don't play these games behind your brother's back." They finished their beers in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The bar continued to live its own life. Someone was laughing loudly at the bar. Someone had lost at pool and was cursing under their breath. And the rock ballad had changed to something more cheerful, but still imbued with melancholy. David looked into the empty bottle as if into a mirror and saw not his reflection there, but the image of Emily, her smile, her eyes that promised everything and nothing. When they left the bar, the night was cool, the stars shining brightly, as if to remind them that the world was bigger than their little dramas. Thomas clapped David on the shoulder, the gesture both friendly and warning. "You're a good guy, David," he said. "Don't let this break you." David nodded, but his mind was already somewhere else at the miller's house, where Emily was probably sitting in the kitchen looking out the window or lying next to John, pretending everything was okay. He knew he should stop, but deep down he was afraid it was too late. They parted ways, Thomas's footsteps echoing on the asphalt, and David walked slowly, his shadow trailing behind him like the ghost of his own mistakes. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Oliver's voice was a reminder of honor, of family, of truth. But another voice, quiet and seductive, whispered of passion, of how life is short, and sometimes you have to take what it offers, even if it is forbidden. The bar was behind him, but the conversation with Thomas echoed in David's head like a warning he wasn't sure he could hear. Night fell on Willow Grove like a heavy velvet blanket, strewn with stars that twinkled as if winking at those who kept their secrets. In the miller's house, the lights burned softly in the windows, but inside the air was charged with tension, like before a storm, when the sky grows heavy and the wind dies down in anticipation. John sat in the living room, his fingers absently leafing through an old magazine he had not even read. His thoughts were elsewhere in the deserts where he had left a part of himself, and in this house that now seemed alien despite the familiar walls and the smell of his mother's pies. Emily was upstairs in their bedroom, but her absence downstairs, where the family usually gathered, felt like an emptiness no one dared name. Matt, the youngest brother, was sitting on the couch, his head glued to his phone, but his eyes kept darting around the room, as if he were searching for clues to what he'd seen in the closet. The scene between Emily and David kept playing in his head, and every time he tried to convince himself it had been a misunderstanding, anxiety rose in his chest like a wave, ready to overwhelm him. He wanted to talk to someone, but who? John had just gotten home, and burdening him with his suspicions felt like a betrayal. Linda, their mother, was too fragile for this kind of conversation, and David was part of the problem. Matt sighed, his fingers hovering over the screen where he'd been mindlessly scrolling through his social media feed. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Linda was finishing washing the dishes, her movements slow, almost mechanical. She felt that something was wrong, but her motherly heart, accustomed to protecting her sons from any storm, refused to accept that a storm could be born within their own family. She remembered Oliver, her late husband, whose voice still sounded in her head, reminding her that family is a fortress that must be protected at all costs. But what to do when cracks appear from within? David, who had been avoiding everyone all evening, appeared in the kitchen doorway, his shadow as long and shifting as his own thoughts. He looked tired, his eyes, usually so alert, glazed, as if he hadn't slept for several nights. Linda turned when she saw him, her face softening, but there was a flicker of worry in her gaze. "David, are you okay?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "You seem a little distant today." He nodded, but his smile was weak, like the light of a lantern in thick fog. "I'm just tired, Mom," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking a lot." Linda came closer, her hand on his shoulder, warm and comforting, like when he was a boy and would come to her with scraped knees. "You always think more than you say," she said softly. "Want to tell me?" David looked at her, and for a moment he wanted to spill it all his feelings for Emily, his conversation with Thomas at the bar, the guilt that was burning inside him. but he knew it would break her heart, and instead he shook his head. Nothing like that, Mom. Just life, you know? Linda didn't believe it, but she didn't press the issue. She knew her sons better than they knew themselves, and she sensed that David was hiding something that could change everything. She returned to the sink, but her thoughts were already circling around her family like moths around a lamp. Meanwhile, Matt, unable to bear the pressure, decided he needed to talk to someone outside the family, but wise enough to offer advice. He thought of Susan Carter, a family friend and psychologist whose ability to see through people both terrified and fascinated him. He dialed her number, and after a few rings she answered, her voice warm as a ray of sunshine on a cold day. "Matt," Susan said, her tone both surprised and pleased. "I didn't expect you to call. What happened?" "Suze, can I meet you?" he asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "I need to talk about stuff." She paused for a second, and Matt could almost hear her professional mind beginning to analyze his words. "Of course," she replied. "Tomorrow morning at the Old Oak? Will it be 10 o'clock?" "Yeah, great," he said, feeling some of the weight lift off his shoulders. "Thanks, Suze." The next morning, Matt sat in the Old Oak Cafe, nervously tapping his fingers on the wooden table. Susan walked in, her dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail and her wire-rimmed glasses giving her the look of someone who always knew what to say. She ordered her usual cinnamon latte and sat across from Matt, her gaze attentive but gentle, as if she were inviting him to open up without words. "Well, Matt," she began, taking a sip of coffee. "You look like you've been up all night solving the world's problems. What's on your mind?" Matt hesitated, his fingers fiddling with the edge of his napkin, tearing it into tiny pieces. He didn't know where to begin, but Thomas's words to David at the bar, overheard as he walked past, echoed in his head. "You have to stop before it's too late." Matt didn't know the whole story, but the scene in the pantry and those words formed a disturbing picture. I saw something," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper, "between Emily and David, in the closet a couple days ago. They were too close, Suze, and they talked like they were hiding something." Susan leaned closer, her eyes narrowed, but she remained calm, like someone accustomed to hearing other people's secrets. "What do you mean, too close?" she asked carefully, her voice even but with a hint of steel in it. Matt sighed, his gaze falling to the table where croissant crumbs formed a chaotic pattern. They were standing almost touching, and Emily, she said something like, "Not now," and David, he looked like he wanted her. "You know?" He blushed, at a loss for words. "I thought maybe I was wrong, but then I heard David talking to Thomas at the bar, something about how he couldn't stop, and I don't know what to do." Susan listened intently, her fingers tapping lightly on her mug, her face expressionless. She had already suspected something like this from her observations at dinner, but Matt's words confirmed her worst fears. She remembered the way Emily had looked away from John, the way her smiles had been warmer for David than for her husband, and the way David had come alive under her attention. It all fits together now, like a dark puzzle with the missing pieces finally falling into place. "Matt," she said softly, but with a firmness that made you listen. "What you saw could be important, but it could also be a misunderstanding. Have you talked to anyone else about this? John, for example?" Matt shook his head, his eyes full of confusion. "No, I can't. He just got back, Suze. If I tell you and it's not true, I'll ruin everything. But if it's true..." He trailed off, his voice shaking. "I don't want our family to fall apart." Susan nodded, her thoughts swirling like leaves in an autumn wind. She knew that secrets like fire in dry grass could spread quickly and destroy everything in their path. But she also knew that Matt was too young and inexperienced to carry the weight alone. "You did the right thing coming to me," she said. "But we have to be careful. These things, they're complicated. If you're right, it could hurt John, Linda, all of you. But if you're wrong, you could get hurt for no reason. Let's do this. I'll talk to Emily gently to figure out what's going on. And you, try not to jump to conclusions. And don't tell anyone yet, okay? Matt nodded, but his face was tense, as if he was still fighting the urge to run to John and spill it all. Okay, he said finally. But Suze, if it's true, what then? Then we'll figure it out, she replied, her voice as steady as an anchor in a stormy sea. Step by step. The main thing is not to let emotions get the better of us. They finished their coffee in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Susan was thinking about how to approach Emily without arousing suspicion, and how to protect Matt from the burden he had taken on himself. Matt, looking out the window at the people going about their business, felt like his world, so simple and understandable a week ago, was collapsing like a house of cards. Meanwhile, at the Miller's house, Emily stood in front of the bedroom mirror, looking at herself. Her dark hair was loose, and the dress she'd picked out for dinner showed off her figure, but her eyes were full of doubt. She thought about John, his tired eyes, trying to get back to normal, and about David, whose presence made her heart beat faster despite the guilt that burned inside her. She knew she couldn't go on like this, but the thought of stopping scared her as much as the thought of the truth coming out. Downstairs, John walked out onto the veranda where he had once sat with his father, listening to his stories of honesty and duty. He looked up at the stars, and his thoughts swirled around Emily. He felt her distance, but he chalked it up to his long absence. But somewhere deep inside, where his military instincts were still alert, he sensed that something was wrong, and it followed him like a shadow, promising that things would soon change. The evening in the Miller house was deceptively quiet, like the calm before a storm, when the air grows heavy and the birds fall silent, sensing the inevitable. The living room was lit by a soft lamp, casting warm shadows on the walls, which were decorated with old family photographs. In one, Oliver Miller, the late father, looked on with stern pride, his eyes seeming to follow every movement in the room, a reminder of the principles he had drummed into his sons: honesty, duty, family. But today, those principles were on the verge of collapse, and the house, always a refuge, was an arena where the truth was about to strike. John sat in his chair, his fingers clenched around a glass of whiskey that he had barely sipped. His face, hardened by years of service, was tense, his eyes like two dark lakes that reflected memories of the war, and something new, more personal, that was burning inside him. He could no longer ignore Emily's coldness, her evasive glances, her distant touches that were more habit than love. And those moments when she looked at David, his brother, his shadow, the man who was always there, but never in the center. John felt the suspicions that had been building for days turning into certainty, and this certainty was like a knife slowly piercing his heart. Emily was in the kitchen, her movements jerky, almost feverish, as she shuffled dishes, as if trying to drown out her thoughts with the noise. David was sitting in the living room, across from John, his book open in his lap, but he wasn't reading. His eyes kept drifting toward the kitchen, where Emily was flickering. Matt was upstairs in his room, his nose buried in his books, but his thoughts were still swirling around the pantry scene and his conversation with Susan, who had promised to look into it, but hadn't yet provided any answers. Linda had gone to the neighbors, leaving her sons alone, and her absence made the house even more vulnerable, like a ship without a captain on a stormy sea. John put down his glass, his movement slow, but with a sense of contained strength, like a spring about to spring back. He looked at David, and his voice, when he spoke, was low, almost menacing, like distant thunder. "David," he said, and the word hung in the air, heavy as lead. "We need to talk." David looked up, his face paler than usual, and there was a flicker of worry in his eyes that he tried to hide behind his usual mask of calm. "About what?" he asked, closing the book, but his fingers were shaking slightly. John leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes boring into his brother as if they could pierce his soul. "About you, and about Emily," he said, and each word was like a hammer blow. "I'm not blind, David. I see the way she looks at you, the way you look at her, and I want to know the truth, right now." David froze, his breathing uneven, as if the air had suddenly become too thick. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words caught in his throat. At that moment, There was a clatter in the kitchen. Emily had dropped a plate, and the shards of glass scattered across the floor like stars falling from the sky. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, as if she already knew what was about to happen. "John," she said, her voice shaking but trying to remain firm. "Don't start. Please." "Don't start." John stood up abruptly, his body tensing like a predator about to pounce. "Do you think I don't notice, Emily? Do you think I don't see the way you look away, the way you avoid me? And you, David," he turned to his brother, his voice growing louder, "do you think I didn't know that you were here while I was gone, that you were with her?" David stood up, his hands clenched into fists, but still trying to hold on, his voice quiet but full of pain. "John, it's not what you think," he said, but his words sounded unconvincing, like a lie he himself didn't believe. "Not what I think." John stepped closer, his face twisted in anger, but underneath it, pain as deep as an abyss. "Then tell me what it is, David. Tell me why she looks at you like you're her savior, and I'm a stranger in my own home." Emily stepped forward, her hands raised as if she could stop the storm. "John, stop!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "It's not his fault. It's mine." John turned to face her, his eyes narrowing, and in that moment the truth he had been so afraid to hear came pouring out like water from a broken dam. "Yours?" he asked, his voice quieter, but there was a fury in it that was almost tangible. "What do you mean, Emily? Tell me. Now." Emily swallowed, her hands shaking, but she lifted her chin, her eyes shining with the tears she was trying to hold back. "While you were gone," she began, her voice hoarse, "I was alone. For months. For years. You left, John, and I didn't know if you'd come back. David was here. He helped, he listened, he was there. And I let it go too far." The words hit John like a bullet, and for a moment he froze, his face pale and his eyes dark as the sky before a hurricane. He turned to David, who stood with his head down, his shoulders tense, as if he were expecting a blow. "You slept with my wife?" John asked, his voice cold as ice, but there was fire burning underneath. David looked up, his face contorted with guilt and despair. "No," he said quickly. "No, John, I swear. It didn't come to that. But I fell in love with her, and I couldn't stop." Those words were the last straw. John let out a sound like a growl, and the next second his fist slammed into David's jaw with such force that he staggered back, hitting the wall. Emily screamed, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "John, stop it!" she screamed, rushing towards him, but he pushed her away, not hard, but enough to make her flinch. David sat up straight, his lips split, blood dripping down his chin, but he didn't back down. His eyes were ablaze with a mixture of guilt and stubbornness, as if he was ready to accept punishment but not ask for forgiveness. "Hit me again if it makes you feel better," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "I deserve it." John didn't take long to respond. His leg, trained by years of service, shot out in a swift motion and caught David square in the face, right on the cheekbone. David fell to the floor, his head slamming into the coffee table, the sound echoing around the room. Emily screamed again, her voice filled with horror and pain, and she rushed toward David, her hands shaking as she tried to help him up. "John, stop," she cried, her tears finally breaking through, streaming down her cheeks. "It's my fault, not his. Please." John stood over them, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched, but there was not only rage in his eyes now, but pain so deep it seemed to tear him apart. He looked at Emily, who was holding David, at his brother, whose face was covered in blood, and he felt the world he knew crumble like a sandcastle under a wave. "You," he began, his voice breaking, "you were everything, Emily, and you." He looked at David, "You were my brother." David tried to stand up, his arm resting on Emily, but he kept his eyes on John. "I know," he said quietly, "and I hate myself for it." Emily was crying, her hands still holding David, but her eyes were fixed on John, full of pleading and guilt. "John, I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice barely audible. I love you. I've always loved you. But I'm confused. John shook his head, his face a mask hiding the storm within. Confused? He repeated, his voice full of bitterness. You think that's an excuse? At that moment, Matt ran into the living room, drawn by the screams. His eyes widened when he saw David on the floor, blood on his face, Emily crying, and John standing there like a statue about to collapse. What's going on? Matt asked, his voice shaking like a child who'd just seen his world crumble. John turned to face him, his eyes empty as a scorched desert. Ask them, he said, and headed for the door, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying the whole world on his shoulders. Emily tried to stand up to stop him, but her legs gave out, and she sank back to the floor, next to David. Matt looked at them, his face pale, his heart pounding like it was going to burst out of his chest. He knew what he'd seen in the closet. He knew what Susan had said, but the reality was worse than he could have imagined. The door slammed as John walked out, the sound like the final chord that closed the melody of their family. Emily buried her face in her hands, her sobs filling the room, and David, still clutching his broken face, stared into the empty space where his brother had stood. Matt stood there, unsure of what to do, his world crumbling, and he could feel the shadow of Oliver, their father, staring at them from the photograph, his eyes full of disappointment. Outside the night was dark and silent, but in the Miller's house the silence was louder than any scream, and the truth, when it finally came out, left only destruction in its wake. Morning came with a heavy silence in Willow Grove, as if the town itself were holding its breath, sensing that a drama was unfolding in one of its homes that would scar generations. The Miller's house, usually warm and full of life, now seemed cold, as if the walls had absorbed the pain and anger that had spilled out the night before. The living room, where screams and blows had echoed the day before, was now empty, but the air still echoed with the storm that had torn the family apart. The photograph of Oliver Miller, hanging above the fireplace, looked out into the empty room with a stern calm, his eyes seeming to hold all the answers his sons so desperately sought. Linda Miller sat at the kitchen table, her hands, usually busy cooking or knitting, now lying motionless on the tablecloth, clutching an old handkerchief that she tugged at like a talisman. Her face, lined with lines that told a story of love and loss and tireless care for her family, was pale, and her eyes were red from a sleepless night. She had learned of what had happened from Matt, who, unable to contain it all, had come to her late at night, his voice shaking as he told of the fight, of Emily's confession, of John leaving with a slammed door. Linda listened, her heart clenching as if someone were slowly squeezing the life out of it, but she did not allow herself to cry. Not then. She was a mother, and it was her duty to hold the family together, even when it was falling apart at the seams like an old blanket that had been mended for too long. Linda knew she couldn't let this go. She couldn't let her sons, her boys, whom she had raised with such love, tear each other apart. She thought of Oliver, his steady voice, his unwavering belief that family was more than blood. It was a choice to stick together no matter what. His words, repeated as he sat in the old rocking chair on the porch, echoed in her head. Loyalty isn't just words, it's something you do every day, even when it hurts. Linda knew it was time to gather her sons, look them in the eye, and remind them of who they were and who they were meant to be. She texted John, David, and Matt, her fingers shaking as she typed, but the words were simple and firm. Come home. This afternoon. We need to talk. She didn't invite Emily, not because she didn't consider her family, but because she knew this conversation had to be between the Miller bloodlines, between those who carried Oliver's legacy. Emily, with her guilt and pain, had to wait her turn. By midday, the house was filled with the heavy air of a courtroom where everyone knew their guilt, but no one was prepared to admit it out loud. John entered first, his steps heavy, as if he carried an invisible weight on his shoulders. His face was grim, there were dark circles under his eyes, and the stubble he usually shaved off gave him the look of a man who had not slept and was not going to give in. He nodded to Linda, but his gaze was cold as steel, and he avoided looking toward the door through which David would enter. David came in next, his face still scarred from the previous day's blow. His cheekbone was bruised, his lips slightly swollen, but he held himself straight, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and determination. He looked at John, who had turned away, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth seemed about to crack. Matt came in last, his movements nervous, like a teenager caught in the act. He felt like an outsider in this room, where adult problems loomed over him like storm clouds, but he knew he couldn't leave. He was part of this family, part of this chaos. Linda stood at the table, her slight frame suddenly majestic, like a judge about to pass a sentence. She gestured toward the chairs, her voice firm but with pain in it, like a crack in old china. "Sit down," she said, and her tone brooked no argument. "All of you." They complied, though John sat as far away from David as he could, his body tense like a spring about to fire. Matt took his place between them, an unwitting buffer, his eyes darting from one brother to the other. Linda remained standing, her hands braced on the table as if she were drawing strength from it. "I raised the three of you," she began, her voice low but with a strength in it, like the wind that heralds a storm. "I watched you grow into men, learn, fall, rise again. Your father, Oliver, taught you to be honest, to be loyal not just to others, but to yourself. He said that family is what makes us strong, what holds us together when the world falls apart. And I look at you now, and I think he would weep, seeing what you have done with his legacy." Her words fell into the room like stones into still water, and the ripples from them spread out, touching everyone. John looked at the floor, his fingers curled into fists, but he said nothing. David hung his head, his face twisted, as if his mother's words had cut him deeper than John's blow. Matt nervously fiddled with the hem of his t-shirt, feeling like a child who wanted to hide but couldn't. "John," Linda turned to her eldest son, her eyes full of pain but also determination. "You came home, and I know you brought with you wounds none of us can see. But you're my son, and I know your heart. You're strong, but strength isn't just about your fists. It's about forgiving, even when it hurts. You hit your brother. You raised your hand to your own blood. Is that what your father taught you?" John looked up, his gaze firm, but with a hint of doubt in it. "He betrayed me, Mom," he said, his voice hoarse, as if each word was a struggle. "He and Emily, he trailed off, unable to continue, his jaw clenched. Linda nodded, her face not flinching, but her eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall. "I know, John," she said quietly. "I know what they did. But do you think your father would have just walked away, given up? He would have fought for his family, not with his fists, but with his heart." She turned to David, her gaze growing stern, as if she were looking not at her son, but at a man who had broken a sacred law. "David," she said, and her voice shook, but she quickly regained her composure. "You were always my quiet boy, the one who saw more than he said. But what you did, what you allowed to happen, it was a betrayal, not just of John, but of everything your father and I built. You fell in love with your brother's wife. You let it grow like a weed, and now it's choking us all. How can you even look at yourself in the mirror?" David swallowed, his eyes shining but not looking away. He knew he deserved every word, and yet the pain they left behind was unbearable. "I didn't mean to, Mom," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I tried to stop. I swear I tried. But she was alone, and I couldn't leave her alone. I know it was wrong. I know Father would be disappointed." Linda closed her eyes for a moment, her face contorted as if she were trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to come. She remembered Oliver, his strong arms, his voice saying, "Loyalty is a choice you make every day, even when it tears you apart." She opened her eyes, her gaze full of determination. "Your father," she said, her voice firmer, "said that love is no excuse for betrayal. He said that if you love someone, you put their happiness before your own. You, David, chose yourself, and you, John, chose anger, and you both forgot what it meant to be brothers." Matt, who had been silent until then, suddenly raised his head, his eyes full of confusion. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking like a boy who just realized the world wasn't as simple as he thought. "I saw them in the closet. I knew something was wrong, But I didn't say anything. Is this, is this my fault too? Linda looked at her youngest son, her face softened, and she walked towards him, placing her hand on his shoulder. No, Matt, she said softly, it's not your fault. You're the child in this story, and your only mistake was trying to protect us all by keeping it to yourself. But now the truth is out, and we can't hide from it. She walked back to the center of the room, her gaze sliding over her sons, and in that moment she seemed taller, stronger, as if Oliver's spirit stood behind her, supporting her. Your father, she continued, her voice deepening, filled with memory, once told me a story. He was young, just starting out in the shop, and he had a friend who had fallen in love with someone else's wife. The friend came to him for advice, and Oliver told him, if you love her, let her go. Because true love doesn't destroy families, it builds them. The friend didn't listen, and his life went downhill. Oliver said it was a lesson for him loyalty not only to his wife, but to his principles, to his conscience. And I want you to remember those words now. John clenched his fists, his eyes shining, but he remained silent. David looked at the floor, his face twisted in pain, as if every word his mother said cut him like a knife. Matt felt tears stinging his eyes, but he held back, not wanting to appear weak. What do we do, Mom? John asked finally, his voice hoarse, full of weariness and pain. How do I live with this? How do I look at him, knowing that they... Linda sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight she was carrying had become even heavier. I don't know, John, she said honestly. I don't know how to heal this wound. But I do know that if you don't find a way to forgive not for their sake, but for yours, you will lose each other forever. And that will be worse than any war you've ever seen. David looked up, his eyes full of tears, but he forced himself to speak. I'm leaving, he said quietly. I can't stay here knowing what I've done. I'm leaving so I don't make things worse. John turned sharply to face him, his face flushing with anger again. Leave, he barked. You think that's going to fix everything? You think running away is the answer? Enough. Linda slammed her palm down on the table, and the sound was like a gunshot in the silence. Stop fighting. You're brothers, damn it. You're all I have left of Oliver, and I won't let you tear each other to pieces. Her voice broke, and the tears she had been holding back for so long finally came. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking, and in that moment she seemed less like a mother and more like a woman who had lost too much and was afraid of losing even more. Matt jumped up, hugging her, his own tears finally spilling out. Mom, I'm sorry, he whispered. We'll fix it, I promise. John and David looked at each other, their eyes full of pain, anger, guilt, and something else, the remnants of the love that had bound them together since childhood, when they had shared toys and secrets and dreams. John was the first to look away, his fists unclenching as he slumped into his chair. I don't know if I can forgive, he said quietly, but I don't want to lose my family, not again. David nodded, his voice barely audible. I'll do anything to fix this, he said, even if it means leaving. Linda wiped away her tears, her face hard as a rock again, but her voice was soft, like a mother comforting her children after a nightmare. No one is going anywhere, she said. Not today. We will talk, we will cry, we will fight, but we will stay together, because that's what your father taught us, and I won't let you forget it. She looked at Oliver's picture, and a spark of hope flickered in her eyes, as if she felt he was there, holding her up, as he had in life. The room was silent, but it wasn't the silence that preceded a storm. It was the silence that was heavy, but filled with the possibility of healing. The Miller family was on the brink of destruction, but Linda, with her love and strength, was ready to be the bridge that would keep them from falling. Outside, Willow Grove was going on as usual. Children playing in the street, cars driving by, and the sun rising higher, casting a soft glow on the town. But in the Miller's house, time stood still, and each of them knew that this conversation was just the beginning of a long journey where they would have to remember what it meant to be a family, despite the pain, betrayal, and tears. Willow Grove awoke slowly, as if reluctantly emerging from the embrace of the night that blanketed the town in stars and silence. The morning light, soft and golden, filtered through the leaves of the old oaks, casting lacy shadows on the sidewalks, but in the miller's house this light seemed alien, unable to penetrate the cold that had settled in the walls after the stormy night. The living room, so recently full of screams and tears, was now empty, but the echo of pain still hung in the air like dust raised by a hurricane. The photograph of Oliver Miller on the wall, with his stern but kindly gaze, seemed to watch everything with silent reproach, a reminder of the principles he had so carefully instilled in his family. But now those principles were trampled, and the house, once a fortress, turned into ruins, where every step echoed with pain. Emily stood in the bedroom, her movements mechanical, like someone on autopilot. She was packing a small suitcase, a few dresses, a couple of sweaters, a makeup bag that seemed absurdly ordinary in the chaos. Her dark hair was pulled back carelessly into a ponytail, and her face, usually beaming with confidence, was now pale, with dark circles under her eyes that betrayed a sleepless night of tears and reflection. She couldn't stay in this house any longer, where every corner was a reminder of her mistake, her betrayal, the way she had let passion cloud her conscience. John hadn't come home from his conversation with Linda the night before, and his absence was like a knife she had stabbed into her own heart. David had locked himself in his room, and his silence was louder than any words. Matt, poor Matt, was looking at her with such a mixture of pity and confusion that she felt even worse. Emily knew she had to leave, not for herself, but for them, for John, who deserved better than a wife who had betrayed his trust, for David, whose love for her had become a poison that was poisoning them both, for Linda, who looked at her with pain but without judgment, which was worse. She took one last look at the bedroom, at the bed where she and John had once laughed, planned the future, dreamed of children. Now that bed was as cold as the grave of their marriage, and Emily felt the tears welling up in her eyes again. She brushed them away with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, and zipped up her suitcase. Downstairs, Linda sat at the kitchen table, her hands clutching a cold cup of tea she hadn't even drunk. She heard Emily's footsteps on the stairs and looked up, her face tired but determined, like a woman who had suffered too much loss to allow herself to break. Emily paused in the kitchen doorway, her suitcase at her feet, a symbol of her defeat. "Linda," she began, her voice hoarse, as if the words were stuck in her throat. I, I'm leaving. I can't stay here, not after everything." Linda looked at her, her eyes full of pain, but there was no anger in them, only deep, maternal sorrow. "Emily," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm, like old wood that had weathered years of storms. "You made a choice, and now you have to live with it. But this house, it was your home. You were my daughter, not just my daughter-in-law, and it hurts me to see it all fall apart." Emily swallowed, her eyes shining with the tears she was trying to hold back. "I know," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I loved John. I love him. But I lost myself, and I don't know how to fix it." Linda stood up, her movements slow, as if each step took her strength. She walked over to Emily, placing her hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was warm but also farewell. "Sometimes," she said, "the only way to fix something is to leave. But remember, Emily, you can always come back if you find the strength to be honest. Not just with us, but with yourself." Emily nodded, her tears finally breaking through, and she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Linda hugged her, but it was short, as if she was afraid that too long a goodbye would break her heart. Emily picked up her suitcase and walked out of the house without looking back, her footsteps echoing on the porch like the last notes of a melody that would never play again. She headed to Catherine Hughes, her best friend, whose house was just a few blocks away. Catherine had always been her rock, her confessor, the person who knew her best except, perhaps, David. Emily hoped that Catherine would understand, that she could hold her and tell her that everything would be okay, even if it was a lie. But when she knocked on the door, she was met not with her friend's usual warm gaze, but with a cold distance, as if an invisible wall had grown between them. Catherine opened the door, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun, her eyes, usually so kind, now as stern as a judge's. She crossed her arms, not inviting Emily in, and her silence spoke louder than any words. "Catherine," Emily began, her voice shaking, "I need to talk. I'm leaving. I can't stay at the Miller's house." Catherine looked at her, her lips pressed into a thin line, and when she spoke, her voice was cold as the winter wind. "I know, Emily," she said. "Thomas told me. Everything. How could you? John just got back, and you're with his brother. You think I can just forget about it and continue being your friend like nothing happened?" Emily felt the ground shift beneath her. She had expected condemnation, but not from Catherine, who had always been her refuge. "Cat, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I was confused. I was alone, and David, he was there. I know it's no excuse, but That's enough," Catherine snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. "You betrayed John. You betrayed their family, and you think you can come to me and expect me to hold your hand and pity you? I can't, Emily. Not after this." Emily took a step back, her suitcase feeling heavy, as if it contained not her belongings, but her own guilt. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Catherine shook her head, her expression softening, but only for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "but I can't be there for you now. Maybe someday, but not now." She closed the door, and the sound was like the final nail in the coffin of her friendship with Emily. Emily stood on the porch, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't try to stop them. She felt like the whole world had turned its back on her, and it was her fault, her choice, her failure. Meanwhile, Thomas Hughes, sitting in his patrol car on the outskirts of town, thought about his conversation with David in the bar. He had warned him, told him this was a recipe for destruction, but David hadn't listened, and now it had all come crashing down like a house of cards in a gust of wind. Thomas was a man of the law, accustomed to seeing the world in black and white, with right and wrong, and to him Emily's betrayal was not just a personal mistake, but a violation of a moral code he respected. He had known Emily since she had been John's fiancée, full of hope and light, but now he saw in her only a shadow of that woman, and his trust in her had evaporated like morning mist in the sun. When Catherine told him about Emily's visit, Thomas only nodded, his face as dark as the sky before a storm. "She made her choice," he said, his voice hard as granite. "And now she has to live with it. I don't want her anywhere near you, Cat. Not now. Not after what she did to John." Catherine nodded, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She loved Emily, but her betrayal was too deep, too painful, to simply forgive and forget. Emily, alone, climbed into her old sedan, her suitcase in the back seat as a reminder of her exile. She didn't know where to go, she had no friends left in Willow Grove, and going back to her parents in another state seemed like too much of a loss. She turned on the radio, but even the soft chords of an old song couldn't drown out the emptiness in her chest. She remembered Oliver's words, which Linda often repeated, "Honesty is what makes us human." Emily knew she had lost that honesty, and now she had to find a way to get it back, even if it meant starting over from scratch. In the Miller house, Linda sat alone, her eyes glued to the photograph of Oliver. She remembered him talking about forgiveness, about family being about joy as well as pain that needed to be endured together. She knew Emily was gone, and her heart was breaking with the loss, but she also knew her sons were still here, and she had to be strong for them. John, who had been wandering around the city all night, finally returned home. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes were red from fatigue, but there was still a fire burning in them that had not gone out despite the pain. He looked at Linda, and his voice was hoarse, as if after a long silence. "Did she leave?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. Linda nodded, her eyes full of tears, but she didn't let them fall. "She did what she thought was right," she said. "Now we need to do the same." John sank into his chair, his shoulders slumping as if all his anger had burned away, leaving only ashes. He thought of Emily, how he had loved her, how he had dreamed of a future with her, and how it had all fallen apart. He thought of David, his brother, who had been his rock but had become a traitor. And he thought of his father, whose words about loyalty now sounded like bitter irony. Matt, hearing John's footsteps, came downstairs, his face pale but his eyes full of determination. He looked at his brother, at his mother, and felt that despite the collapse, they were still a family, and that was something worth fighting for. "We'll get through this," he said quietly, his voice unsure but sincere. "Right, John?" John looked at him, and a shadow of a smile flickered in his eyes, the first in a long time. "Maybe," he said, "but it'll be damn hard." Linda took their hands, her touch warm as a ray of sunshine breaking through the clouds. She knew the road to healing would be long, full of pain and tears, but she believed that Oliver's spirit, his lessons, and his love would help them survive this collapse and build something new from its ruins. Outside, Willow Grove went on, oblivious to the family's struggle with demons that threatened to tear it apart. But in this small town where everyone knew everyone, rumors were already beginning to spread like wildfire, and Emily's departure into the unknown left a mark that would long remind her of her mistake. Willow Grove seemed to slow down, as if the town sensed that one of its families was drowning in pain and despair. Autumn had crept into town, turning the leaves crimson and gold, but in the miller's home, the colors of the world seemed faded, like an old photograph forgotten in the attic. The house, once full of laughter and warmth, was now filled with a silence that was louder than any screams. The walls that held memories of the brothers' childhood, of Oliver's teachings, of Linda's love, now seemed to have absorbed the poison of betrayal and anger, and every creak of the floorboards was a reminder of what had been lost. David Miller sat in the rusty Anchor bar, in the same corner where he had shared his pain with Thomas Hughes. The neon light from the sign reflected in his eyes, but they were empty, as if all life had drained from them. He was on his third bottle of whiskey, and the level was steadily decreasing, like sand in a clock, counting down his decline. His fingers, usually steady and sure, trembled as he raised the glass to his lips, and each sip burned his throat, but did nothing to stop the pain that was gnawing at him from within. He saw Emily's face before him, her eyes full of confusion and desire, her voice whispering, "Not now," and John's face twisted in anger as his foot slammed into his cheekbone. David had deserved that blow, he knew it, but the knowledge did not make the pain any easier. His job, a modest accountant position at a local construction company, was lost as quickly as his self-respect. He stopped showing up to the office on time, forgot to turn in reports, and one day, in a fit of drunken frankness, he snapped at his boss, Robert Banks, who had once been John's friend. Robert, a straightforward and strict man, would not tolerate such behavior. "You're burying yourself, David," he said as he signed the order to resign. David didn't argue, didn't apologize, he simply walked away, leaving behind the smell of whiskey and the bitter aftertaste of failure. Now he sat at the bar, his thoughts tangling like the threads of an old sweater that was long overdue for the throwaway. He remembered the words of Oliver, his father, whose voice echoed in his head like a distant echo. "Honesty is what makes us human, David. Without it, we're just shadows." But David felt like a shadow, a ghost wandering through the ruins of his life, unable to pick up the pieces. He drank to drown out his guilt, but every sip only fueled it, like fuel for the fire that was burning inside him. Meanwhile, John Miller wandered the outskirts of Willow Grove, his steps heavy as if he carried an invisible weight on his shoulders. His face, hardened by war, was now closed off like a fortress that no one could enter. He avoided the house, where every room was a reminder of Emily, of her betrayal, of a brother who had become an enemy. John withdrew into himself, his words becoming rare as the rain in the desert, and his smile, once warm and open, fading like the sun over the horizon. He spent hours sitting by the river, watching the water flow without stopping, without caring about his pain. The war had taught him how to survive, but it had not taught him how to cope with such loss, the loss of trust, of love, of family. Linda, their mother, felt her heart break as she looked at her sons. She sat in the living room, her hands clutching the old Bible that Oliver had read to her in the evenings when the boys were little. She wasn't religious in the strict sense, but those pages, covered in his notes, were her connection to her husband, whose wisdom she needed now more than ever. Linda tried to talk to John, but he brushed her off, his eyes as empty as the windows of an abandoned house. She tried to reach out to David, but he either avoided her or came home drunk, his breath reeking of whiskey, his words full of self-deprecation. Matt, the youngest, was the only one still holding on, but even he was beginning to drift away, throwing himself into his studies as a life preserver to keep from drowning in the family chaos. One evening, Linda decided to gather her sons again. She couldn't bear to watch her family fall apart, to watch the threads she had so carefully woven into the fabric of their lives break one by one. She cooked dinner, simple but warm, like the old days. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, the apple pie Oliver loved so much. But when she called her sons to the table, the atmosphere was far from that of those family evenings when laughter and conversation filled the house. John walked in first, his clothes rumpled and his face a mask hiding the storm within. He sat down without looking at the others, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. David followed, his steps unsteady, his eyes red, the smell of alcohol hovering around him like an invisible companion. Matt walked in last, his eyes darting between the brothers as if he were searching for a way to diffuse the tension but couldn't find the words. Linda stood at the head of the table, her frail figure the only anchor in this sea of chaos. She looked at her sons, her eyes full of pain but also determination, like someone who knows the battle is not yet lost. "I don't know how much longer I can take this," she began, her voice quiet but strong, like the roots of an old tree that hold it together even in a storm. "You are my sons, my blood, my life. But you are destroying yourselves, and I can't just watch. Your father—" She paused, her voice breaking, but she quickly regained her composure. "Your father taught you to be stronger than your mistakes. He said that family is something worth fighting for, even when all seems lost." John looked up, his gaze heavy as lead. "Family," he said, his voice full of bitterness. "What family, Mom? My wife left. My brother." He looked at David, his eyes flashing with anger. "He stole her from me. And you want me to pretend everything is okay?" David clenched his fists, his face contorting as if John's words had been a physical blow. "I didn't steal her," he said, his voice hoarse, as if he were speaking through pain. "I didn't mean to, John. I hate myself for it. But do you think this is easy? I lost my job. I lost you. I lost everything. I drink to forget, but it doesn't help." "Stop feeling sorry for yourself," John snapped, his voice growing louder, like thunder. "You made a choice, David. You chose her over me. And now you want me to feel sorry for you." Matt, who had been silent until then, suddenly slammed his fist on the table, his face turning red with suppressed emotion. "Enough," he shouted, his voice suddenly loud, as if he was releasing everything that had been building up inside him for weeks. "You both act like this is just your pain. What about Mom? What about me? I don't want to choose between you. I want us to be a family again, but you're both too busy ruining everything." Linda looked at Matt, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She walked up to him, placing her hand on his shoulder, her touch warm as a ray of sunshine on a cold day. "Matt," she said softly, "you're right. This isn't just their pain. It's our pain, but we can't just give up." Oliver wouldn't give up. He would find a way, even if it meant swallowing his pride, his pain, his anger. John shook his head, his face like stone, but a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. "I don't know how, Mom," he said quietly. "I don't know how to live with this. Every time I look at David, I see her, and I can't turn it off." David stood up. His movements were abrupt, as if he could not bear this conversation any longer. He looked at Linda, his eyes full of despair. "I'm leaving," he said. "I can't stay here. I'll only ruin everything." Linda stepped towards him, her hand grabbing his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for such a fragile woman. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice as firm as a rock. "You're my son, and this house is your home. You made a mistake, David, a big mistake. But running away is not the answer. You have to stay and face this." David looked at her, his eyes shining with tears, but he didn't pull away. He knew she was right, but the pain was too great, and the whiskey he drank to dull it only made it worse. John stood up, his steps heavy, as if he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looked at David, and for a moment it looked like he was going to hit him again, but instead he just shook his head. "I can't be near you," he said, his voice full of weariness. "Not now, maybe never." He left, slamming the door, and the sound was like the final chord, ending the melody of their family. Linda watched him go, her heart clenched, but she did not run after him. She knew that John had to find his way, even if it was full of pain. Matt looked at his mother, his eyes full of tears, but he tried to act like an adult, even though inside he felt like a child who had lost everything he knew. "What now, Mom?" he asked quietly. "What are we going to do?" Linda sighed, her gaze falling on Oliver's photograph, and she felt his spirit, his strength, still living within her. "We will live, Matt," she said. "We will fight. And we will remember what it means to be a family, even if it's the hardest thing we've ever done." But deep down, she knew the Miller family would never be the same. David drank, losing himself in whiskey and wine. John withdrew, his heart a fortress no one could enter. Matt tried to be the glue that held them together, but his strength was melting like wax in a fire. And Emily, who had driven off into the unknown, had left behind a void no one could fill. Willow Grove went on with its life. Children played in the park, old people discussed the weather, and autumn leaves fell to carpet the ground. But in the Millers' home, time stood still, and each of them, lost in their own self-destruction, tried to find a way to survive in a world where the family they loved so much was slipping away like sand through their fingers. A year passed, and Willow Grove had passed through another cycle of seasons, from autumn leaves to spring blossoms, and now back to the heat of summer, where the air trembled over the hot asphalt and the smell of mown grass mingled with the scent of flowers from the gardens. But in the Miller house, time seemed to have stopped, frozen at the point where everything had collapsed, leaving only the shards of what had once been a family. The house, once full of laughter and warmth, was now as silent as an abandoned temple, where the echoes of the past sounded louder than the voices of the living. Oliver Miller's photograph still hung on the living room wall, his stern gaze watching everyone who entered, but now it seemed less edifying and more mournful, as if he were mourning what had become of his sons. John Miller was a changed man. His face, already hardened by war, was now chiseled from stone, his eyes as cold as winter lakes where the ice never melted. He had gone back to work, taking a job with a security firm that put his military skills to good use, but his life was as devoid of warmth as a desert without a drop of water. He was rarely home, preferring to spend his evenings alone, sitting by the river or in his truck, looking at the stars that reminded him of those desert nights where he had felt alive. John did not speak of Emily, did not mention David, and even with Linda, his mother, he was guarded, his words as few and far between as rain in a drought. His heart, once open to love, was now closed, a fortress surrounded by walls he had built to keep out more pain. But in this defense, he lost a part of himself, the part that knew how to laugh, dream, believe. Matt, the youngest of the brothers, had changed too. His youthful innocence, which had once made him the light of the family, had been replaced by a cynicism as bitter as the coffee he now drank without sugar. He was still at university, but his enthusiasm had faded like a candle in the wind. Matt's tongue had become sharper, his jokes, once light and carefree, now laced with sarcasm, as if he were using it as a shield to shut out the world. He had seen his brothers destroy themselves. Linda aged faster than she should, and it had hardened him, as if he were afraid that softness would make him vulnerable. Matt avoided talking about the past, but sometimes, when he was alone, he would pull out an old photograph of the four of them, John, David, himself, and Oliver, standing on a fishing trip, laughing in the sun. He looked at her and felt something squeeze in his chest, but quickly removed it, not allowing himself to drown in nostalgia. David was the most broken of them all. His life, once orderly and quiet, was now chaos, like a painting in tatters. He had lost his job and had been unable to find another. His reputation in small Willow Grove had suffered, Rumors of his affair with Emily had spread like wildfire, and no one wanted to get involved with a man who had betrayed his own brother. David was drinking more and more often, his evenings spent at the Rusty Anchor or alone in his room, where the bottles of whiskey multiplied like silent witnesses to his fall. His face, once soft and thoughtful, was now haggard, with deep lines that were not from age, but from an internal war. He avoided Linda, unable to look her in the eye, knowing that she saw him not as her son, but as the man who had destroyed the family. David thought about Emily every day, but she was gone from Willow Grove, and no one knew where she was now. Her absence was like an open wound that would not heal, and his love for her turned into a poison, slowly poisoning him. Linda Miller held on as best she could. Her frail frame seemed to have grown thinner, but her spirit remained as unbending as an old tree that weathers storm after storm. She continued to cook dinners, though the table rarely brought everyone together anymore, and every empty chair felt like a knife in her heart. She prayed at night, holding Oliver's old Bible, asking his spirit to give her the strength to keep her sons from falling apart completely. Linda remembered his words. Family is a choice, Linda. Even when everything else falls apart, you choose to love. But love now seemed like a heavy burden to bear alone, while her sons drowned in their own demons. Susan Carter, a family friend and psychologist, was the only person still trying to hold the threads that held the Millers together. She had seen the family falling apart, and her professional instincts told her that without intervention, they might lose each other forever. Susan met with Matt, who sometimes came to her to talk, though his cynicism made the conversations difficult. She tried to reach John, but he was like a wall, impenetrable and cold. David was even more difficult. He avoided her, as if he were afraid she would see right through him, exposing his guilt, his pain, his broken soul. One warm August evening, Susan decided to host a get-together. She invited Linda and her sons to her home under the guise of dinner, but with the secret hope that she could ignite a spark that would remind them that they were still a family. Her home was cozy, with soft sofas, bookshelves, and the scent of lavender that hung in the air, calming their nerves. The table was set simply but with soul: baked fish, a salad with local vegetables, a bottle of wine that Susan had chosen to lighten the mood. Linda arrived first, her eyes tired, but she smiled, hugging Susan like an old friend who had never betrayed her. "Thank you, Suze," she said quietly. "I know you're trying, but I'm not sure they can be returned." "We'll try," Susan replied, her voice soft but determined. "Sometimes it just takes a small step to get started." Matt came in next, his faded rock band t-shirt hanging on him like it was on a hanger, his eyes wary, like a man expecting a trick. He nodded at Susan, but his smile was taut, like a string about to snap. "I didn't think I'd see you all together," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is this family therapy?" "Just dinner, Matt," Susan replied, her tone light, but her eyes watching him closely. John entered silently, his steps heavy, as if he carried an invisible weight on his shoulders. He nodded to Linda, but avoided her gaze, his face a mask hiding the storm within. David was the last to appear, his clothes rumpled, his eyes red, and the smell of alcohol, though faint, hanging around him like a shadow. He looked at John, but John had turned away, his jaw set as if he were trying not to explode. Dinner began in awkward silence, broken only by the clink of forks and glasses. Susan tried to lighten the mood by telling stories of a recent trip she had made to a neighboring town, about a funny patient who thought his cat was the reincarnation of Shakespeare, but her words fell into the void like stones in a well. Linda ate in silence, her gaze sliding over her sons, and there was so much pain in her eyes that Susan felt her own heart squeeze. Finally, Susan put down her fork and looked at everyone, her voice calm but firm, like someone who knew she was walking on thin ice. "I know this year has been tough," she began, her eyes darting from face to face. "I know you've all lost something important, but I also know you're still family. And family isn't just about the good times, it's about choosing to stick together even when things are falling apart." John snorted, his voice cold as ice. "Family," he said, his eyes narrowing. "What family, Susan? My brother betrayed me. My wife left. And you want me to sit here and pretend it can all be fixed? David looked at him, his face contorted as if John's words had been a physical blow. I'm not asking you to pretend, he said quietly, his voice shaking. I know what I've done. I live with it every day. But I can't change the past, John. I can only try to be better. Better? John laughed, but his laugh was bitter, like poison. You're drinking yourself to death, David. Is that your better? Matt, who had been silent until then, suddenly stood up, his face flushed and his eyes flashing. Enough, he shouted, his voice full of anger and despair. Both of you, do you think you're the only ones hurting? I lost the brothers I loved. I lost my family, and you're both too busy hating each other to notice that Mom is dying from it. Linda winced, her hands gripping the edge of the table, but she said nothing. Her eyes were full of tears, but she held herself, as always, like a rock in a stormy sea. Susan leaned forward, her voice softer, but with a strength in it, like a wind blowing clouds away. Matt is right, she said. You all suffer. But suffering is not the end. It is a chance to start over. Forgiveness is not forgetting what happened. It is choosing to live on despite the pain. Your father, Oliver, spoke of loyalty, of honesty, but he also spoke of love. And love is not just passion or happiness. It is choosing to be there, even when you want to leave. John looked at her, his eyes cold but with a hint of doubt in them, as if her words had struck something deep inside. David lowered his head, his fingers tightening around his glass, and nodded, as if admitting his guilt but not knowing how to atone for it. Matt sat down, his shoulders slumping, as if all his anger had burned away, leaving only weariness. Linda finally spoke, her voice quiet but full of power, like the voice of someone who had seen too much but still believed. I don't know if you can forgive each other, she said, but I know Oliver would want you to try. Not for him, not for me, but for yourselves, because without forgiveness, you will live in this pain forever. Susan looked at them, her eyes full of hope, like the stars in the night sky. Start small, she said. One conversation, one step. You won't go back to who you were, but you can become someone new, together. Dinner ended in silence, but it was a different silence, not heavy like before, but thoughtful, as if each of them were trying to find the strength to take this step. John left first, his steps heavy, but he nodded to Susan, and there was something in the gesture that felt like gratitude. David stayed behind, helping Linda clear the table, his movements slow, but with an attempt to come back to life. Matt watched them, and his cynicism, though not gone, softened a little, as if he had seen a glimmer of hope. Outside, Willow Grove was preparing for the night, the stars shining brightly and the summer wind whispering the possibility of a new beginning. The Millers were broken, but there was a light in Susan's words, in her hint of forgiveness, faint but stubborn, like a candle burning despite the wind. And maybe in time that light would grow brighter, helping them find their way back to each other. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.